What do you think Orwell would have made of our times?
I think the idea of the development of surveillance and the way that it's happening, I think he would find terrifying, but that's because I find it terrifying.
This is Life and Faith, the podcast where we seek to be good company, inviting you to a table of gathered friends, experiences and ideas, and where what's served up might not always agree with you, where you might hear an opinion you wouldn't normally embrace for yourself, but we think it's good to share a table with those with whom we mightn't always agree, because, well, we're all human after all, trying to make sense of our lives, the world, and all things life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
In today's episode, we're asking which dystopia won. Because I'm sure most of us thought the future might be better than this. There's war and rumours of war, fewer true democracies around the world. There's that saying, seeing is believing, yet we find ourselves not being able to quite trust the news or what we see online. We fear we're being manipulated by the powerful, whether individuals, governments or companies. Runaway technological development makes us concerned that our machines will replace us. And aside from all of this, we can't quite shake the sense that we're all hooked on easy distractions while terrible things carry on elsewhere. Now, a bunch of things in that list might feel familiar to us, especially if we've read some of the novels we're going to be discussing today. And we're asking which vision of a world gone sour has proved prophetic. Is it George Orwell's 1984, which introduced terms like Big Brother, doublethink, thoughtcrime to our vocabulary, or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where people exchange freedom for pleasure and everyone is too busy having a good time to worry about being manipulated? Or is it C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, the third book of Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, or Space Trilogy, published 80 years ago this year? Now, Justine, you've wanted to do this episode for a very long time and you really got into it.
Oh, I loved it. This is all downstream of my deep love of That Hideous Strength, which I discovered as a novel a couple of years ago. So, yeah, Sorry, you'll all have to indulge me.
No, it's going to be good. So in this episode of Life and Faith, we hear from three expert fans about how each book anticipated our times. And you're pre-warned, spoilers are coming.
First up, 1984.
If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
George Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, forecast a grim totalitarian future of mass surveillance, propaganda as policy, and brutal repression of enemies of the state. The novel was a massive hit and has now sold tens of millions of copies. It also affects how we speak today. To describe something as Orwellian suggests we're being manipulated or repressed by an overbearing government or institution. The phrase, Big Brother is watching you, evokes being under constant surveillance, even if we happen to be in on the joke because we've signed up to the reality TV show. Political turmoil over in the United States in recent years has seen sales of 1984 spike, perhaps in no small part due to headlines like this one, which appeared in the New York Times on March 29, 2025. We are all living in George Orwell's world now.
Sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it? And so for those of you who didn't read 1984 in Year 10, let me just bring you up to speed. So in the plot, Winston Smith is a low-ranking member of the party, led by the mysterious Big Brother, who exerts authoritarian control over Oceania, formerly Britain. Now, telescreens watch people from within the privacy of their own homes. Everyone's movements and utterances are scrutinised to ensure compliance with party ideology. And Winston works at the Ministry of Truth, where he rewrites history to suit the party version of events. But he's in secret revolt against the party and dreams of bringing it down. And he falls in love with Julia, another rebel. Winston and Julia are eventually caught and ultimately betray one another. And after rounds of questioning, torture and conditioning, Winston pledges allegiance to the party. And the famous last words of the novel are a bleak assessment of human freedom under the boot of repression. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother.
Early on in 1984, there's an asterisk in the book which talks about the appendix on Newspeak.
Peter Marks is Emeritus Professor from the University of Sydney. He's published widely on Orwell and 1984. Here's Peter catching us up on a hallmark of 1984, Newspeak.
And not many novels, I can't even think of any novel that has an asterisk. An asterisk asks you or suggests that you might go to that and then come back to the text. The asterisk tells you about the appendix on Newspeak, and what that does is explain the importance of language as a means of controlling thought. That the whole idea of newspeak, as the word suggests, it's a way of speaking in a new way, but it's speaking in a way that validates the party that controls Oceania, one of the superstates in the book. And the idea behind it is that if I can control language, I can control thought. If I can reduce, and this is what Newspeak does as a new form of language, it reduces the complexity and the variety and the suggestiveness of language to simple phrases and words. So in a sense, it reduces thought to simple, easily manipulable and controlled ideas.
Ignorance is strength. Freedom is slavery. War is peace. Simple slogans that, in the novel, the party uses to exert its hold over reality.
With something like freedom is slavery, it's not so much the three words is powerful, but it's that doublethink of putting together in one phrase two opposing ideas. And basically it suggests or it reflects on the notion that the party can control your ideas by reducing complex thinking to simple phrases or simple slogans.
The loss of depth, the loss of nuance, all through the control of language. This will emerge as a theme in our next interview with Scott Stephens about Brave New World.
If you think about Brave New World, and I know you're going to look at that, there are lots of slogans in that book as well. One of my favourite ones is ending is better than mending. So the notion in Brave New World is that we don't fix things, so you must endlessly consume.
It's a
you throw things away. So those slogans inculcate in all the members of the Brave New World Society this notion. So the idea of advertising, and I think Orwell was interested in advertising. His novel, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, the main character works in advertising. And so there's this sense that we can dominate you. And these are ideas that were sort of coming into force in the 20th century. The idea of mass media, of advertising being a way of manipulating minds.
1984 is news that has stayed news. That's a line from an essay Peter wrote for the Orwell Foundation marking 1984's 75th anniversary. In it, Peter recounts the way that sales of the novel spiked after this incident.
It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office on day one.
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Alternative facts, 4 of the 5 facts he uttered. The one thing he got right was Zeke Miller. 4 of the 5 facts he uttered were just not true. Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods.
That was an exchange between Chuck Todd, a TV host, and Kellyanne Conway, Trump advisor in the first Trump administration, talking about competing versions of reality.
The idea of Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts, I think, is fascinating because the main character in 1984, Winston Smith, that's what he does. He adulterates facts. That's his job. He's working in the Ministry of Truth, which, of course, in the world of 1984 is constructing lies all the time. So he's editing and erasing and manipulating, reconstructing history to suit what the party needs now. And so I think that idea runs and runs and runs. It wasn't invented by Orwell, and it certainly still has application to the world in which we inhabit. That a political party might recognise the value of presenting facts in such a way that they validate their own argument. There's another side to that, though, and I think Orwell is also pertinent here, is that the idea that there is an underlying truth then just gets scrambled to such an extent that we lose not so much the desire, but the expectation that there is a set of facts. Facts are what the party wants you to believe. 2 + 2 = 5, and the great slogan that Winston at the end of the book writes in the dust on the table of the Chestnut Tree Cafe. And that signals 2 + 2 = 5, which of course he's resisted early because he's a person who believes in facts and reality. It explains to us, or it's emblematic of the fact that he has accepted the party's take on reality, its sense of alternative facts. And of course in the world of social media, people listen to that, and that becomes their reality before they have an alternative, before the real facts, whatever they might be. But if you can scramble that systematically, all of a sudden we have no way of holding on to reality or facts. We become cynical and easily manipulable.
Even desire is manipulated in 1984, argues Peter. It becomes a tool of control.
In the book, desire is the thing that can potentially bring down the party, sexual desire. The way that the party gets around that is to channel it into hate. So the notion of having a 2 minutes hate is a way of channeling sexual desire that can be liberating into a negative. So I think that idea of the way in which desire is manipulated, and this is where Brave New World, I think, gets it better, it gets it right. The idea that basically we can do that through consumerism. We can channel ourselves into products that we will constantly want new things, better things, etc., etc. So what Orwell says that force will determine us. Huxley, and this is my reading of Brave New World, is that we can lull a population into subservience, into passivity, by giving them all that they want, by giving them sex, drugs and rock and roll.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting dynamic between the two books in that way. And you might know that Orwell briefly was taught by Huxley at Eton, and they did have a little interchange between them, and both thought that they'd got it right. That Orwell thought, well, his world, which perhaps we might see as more the world of Stalin's Russia or Kim Jong-un's North Korea, Huxley might counteract that with saying, well, in the West, we're being pacified and manipulated by having everything given to us.
Yeah, that's right. I was looking at a letter that Huxley had written to Orwell, and he actually said something about how controlling people through pleasure is more, and he uses the word efficient. And I thought that was really interesting, because it's like all this bother about the boot stamping on the human face forever. It takes too much effort.
It does.
Right? We can make it more efficient through controlling people through pleasure, as you've been describing. I want you to talk about efficiency as a value for our times, right? Like, I mean, we've most recently seen this in the Department of Government Efficiency in Trump's second administration. But I'm also asking about efficiency because that does become a bit of a theme throughout That Hideous Strength, which is the third novel that we'll be looking at. What do you make of Huxley saying that it's more efficient to just control people through pleasure rather than try and just force them to submit to you?
I'm not saying he's wrong. There is perhaps a different efficiency in 1984. So, for example, the 2 minute hate is a very efficient way of getting a mass of people to aim all their aggression, all their hatred at an enemy, at a single enemy. And this, it could be Goldstein, or it could be the people from Eurasia or East Asia, depending on what we need at the particular time. And also, of course, it starts the process whereby this can be reactivated again very quickly. So once you have regular hate sessions, all of a sudden you've got the whole of the country, or at least the members of the party. And that's, I guess, one of the interesting dynamics within 1984 that people don't often point to, is that 85% of the people in the world of Oceania are the proles. So it's only really the people in the party, a very small 15% of the party, and to some extent they're the intellectuals that Orwell was often attacking. But these people can be controlled en masse. So the idea of mass hatred is an efficient way of controlling desire.
It's interesting. I wonder if, just because I mentioned the Department of Government Efficiency, of course, that Elon Musk is headed up, and then Elon bought Twitter, and Twitter seems to me the 2-minute hate machine, basically. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it does work in that way, and also it's a way of getting your message across to millions of people instantly.
Yeah.
And getting it in ahead of other possibilities.
Yes.
So it's an efficient way of grabbing people's attention before they even know that their attention is getting grabbed. So I think in that way, the sort of massification, if that's a relevant term, is an efficient way of doing it, as is Newspeak. If you can have people thinking a smaller group of thoughts and expressing them in a fewer words, you've taken away subtlety, you've taken away nuance. It's an efficient way, but efficiency in this, again, is the destruction of the vitality of literature generally. And in the appendix on Newspeak, we're told that the party was going through the classics of English literature, Shakespeare, etc., trying to rewrite them. But they hadn't at this point. And in a sense, we get an idea that they never do. If the Newspeak appendix at the end is talking about the process by which they're trying to reduce Shakespeare to Newspeak, it hasn't happened. It's supposed to happen maybe by 2050, which says something about the inefficiency of the English language. It's so rich and vital that you can't easily reduce Shakespeare to Newspeak, putting it through a machine.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives.
Any discussion of Orwell's 1984 and its legacy can't ignore the iconic ad that Apple made to partly troll IBM back in the year 1984. In that ad, Apple positioned itself as the upstart defender of individuality over conformity and uniformity.
We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
But fast forward to the present, where these days, Apple has a very different image. One ad that generated a lot of controversy featured musical instruments and tools of human creativity getting crushed in a hydraulic press. And once the press lifts, all that remains is an iPad. The ad fed people's fears. Who's preaching conformity now? The technological disruptor has become the establishment. As Peter goes on to suggest, Apple has become Big Brother in more ways than one.
So the idea that Apple has become the thing that it loathed, I think it's, maybe that's just true technologically anyway, but I think it says a lot about the ways in which Apple has gone from feisty outsider to, in some ways, a Big Brother figure, because one of the things that technology does these days more than Orwell could ever have imagined is to track us, to see or to record and then to play back to us our own likes and dislikes and generate advertising because of the ways in which we give back information about our activities. So this is where a new notion of surveillance capitalism has come in the last few years. There's a book by Shoshana Zuboff, and in that book, she basically dismisses 1984 and says that notion of a sort of top-down party determining us is old-fashioned. That really what we're in is a world of our thoughts and our ideas being, in a sense, monetized and used back against us so that we continue to buy particular products and not buy other products. But in fact, it's a form of conditioning. And that's what surveillance capitalism is about. It's different from the top-down totalitarian notion that Orwell writes about. And I think to some extent she's right, that form of surveillance is something that we're all comfortable with because we want more of the same. We want these, these cheap products, these free access to X, Y, and Z. But the thing is that at the same time, we're being conditioned by Apple or Google or whatever because of the algorithms. The thing is that the state surveillance that Orwell writes about in 1984 hasn't gone away. It's been supplemented by surveillance capitalism, not replaced by it. And it's one, again, going back to Huxley, that's related to pleasure. We're willing to give away
very willing.
Our freedoms in order to get free products. And we're pacified by that. Or you could say we live a far more interesting and exciting life.
In Orwell's 1984, there's a telescreen in everyone's house watching your every move. In our world, there's a telescreen in our pocket or in the palm of our hand.
You're putting information about yourself on a public website
Yeah.
for the benefit of your friends. You curate your identity. And identity is really important in 1984, the idea that, as Julia says in the book, they can't get inside you. And that for her and for Winston is the way in which whatever else is going on in the world, inside my head, I can be free. But the world that we're inhabiting, that space is being taken over, one could argue, and being surveyed because we're giving up information about our likes, our dislikes, what we're doing. And the fact that, that's happening 24/7 and the information is going out to companies, agencies that we know nothing about. And they're using that, and they're using that to sell products back to us.
What do you think Orwell would have made of our times?
I think it's a loaded question, but it's a question where I'm trying to, in a sense, justify my own reading of the world by bringing Orwell onto my side. What do I think? And I'll say that George Orwell said the same thing. I think the idea of the development of surveillance and the way that it's happening, I think he would find terrifying. But that's because I find it terrifying. The idea that it's moved away from the sort of top-down totalitarian to that plus the surveillance capitalism, I think would be interesting. I think the idea too of the ways in which people are willing to give up their individuality to bow down before some powerful leader. I mean, this is nothing that Orwell invented, but I think that's one of the things that we get from 1984 is that people are willing to give up their individuality to be part of something greater, something bigger. They feel the power of the crowd. The 2-minute hate is a way of becoming infinitely more powerful than the feeble individual that you are. So I think that idea that it's been massified and monetized, I think he would find interesting. How language is still being used to manipulate, and how the misuse of language as a way of dominating people or unsettling them. That's certainly an ongoing issue for him right the way through his life. 1984 has one instance of that. But he wrote an essay called Politics in the English Language, which he talks about the ways in which the political language is being murdered in his own time, pre-1984, and that euphemism, et cetera, fills in for reality. And in that essay, which people often forget, I think, at the end of it, he basically implores his readers, the public, he's not talking here to intellectuals, he basically implores ordinary people to challenge the misuse of language, to think more clearly, to write more clearly, to call out the sloganeering, the lies. But one of the things that he was asked by a reader, whether Orwell thought that the world that he had presented was inevitable. Was the world of 1984 inevitable? And he said no. He said it in the future, it's what might happen. And he made a point of setting it in, what was England, but is now Oceania. He set it in the West because he said that Western societies aren't somehow immune from totalitarianism. So he thought it was important that his readers didn't say, oh, this is what's happening in the Soviet Union, or this is what's happening in China, this is what's happening somewhere else. This is what could happen here. So he said the basic argument of the story is, don't let it happen. It's up to you to resist.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're discussing which dystopia won. We've heard about 1984. Next up, Brave New World, published in 1932 by English writer Aldous Huxley. These two novels are often the usual suspects when it comes to dystopian literature, but they're at loggerheads with each other. In fact, Huxley's biographer, Nicholas Murray, recounts that after Huxley read an early copy of 1984 that Orwell had sent to him, Huxley wrote back to say he'd enjoyed it, but believed his, that is Huxley's book, was better prophecy. No need for a boot smashing down on the human face forever when you can get people to love their oppression. Or, as it's said in the novel,
a really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude.
Brave New World is set in a futuristic world state where you can medicate your way to happiness in comfort and safety. Technological advancements mean that humanity is made on the production line and engineered into discrete castes. Free love is a public good. Sex is completely severed from reproduction. There's no more family, and mother is a dirty word. There are still places, like the Savage Reservation, that exist on the edges of the world state. And in these places, people continue to marry, they continue to worship, they raise children the old-fashioned way, and they're vulnerable to pain and suffering. And then, a guy who grew up on that Savage Reservation, John the Savage, visits the world state. He ends up saying, "I ate civilization, and it poisoned me." George Orwell described Brave New World as, and this is a quote, "a brilliant caricature of the present that probably casts no light on the future."
Let me be really blunt with you. I've just always hated Orwell. I just don't like George Orwell, and I never understood why everyone thought 1984 was so great.
This is Scott Stevens, editor of ABC Religion and Ethics, and co-host with Waleed Ali of the podcast The Minefield.
And then coming across a book like Brave New World, which was earlier than Orwell's, which is, I think, literarily more sophisticated than Orwell's. The plot isn't as good. The plot is pretty superficial. But there's a depth of learning, and I thought a kind of clarity of vision to Aldous Huxley's vision of what the future was going to be like, that attracted me, that bewildered me, and that enticed me for quite some time. And then in the middle of all of that, I came across this extraordinary line in Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he says, everyone reading Orwell thought that the future was going to be totalitarian and the great threat to human life and human community was going to come from outside. It was going to be repression. It was going to be state, external oppression. And he said, really, the lesson of Aldous Huxley is, why do you need to oppress people from without when you can trivialize people's souls from within? Why censor speech when you can render people incapable of knowing the difference between true speech and false speech? Why bar people from the truth when you can simply inundate them with triviality? And I thought, my God, that's it. That really captures our moment. It's not that we don't have external threats. We do. But so many of the things that really do oppress our souls, that really do corrupt our capacity to live well and to live together, most of those threats don't come from without. They really do come from within. And I think the vision that Aldous Huxley held up, and here I would put him in the same category as Ray Bradbury, his extraordinary novel Fahrenheit 451 from, 1953. I think Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, they provide a vision where human beings are enslaved, but they're complicit in their own self-enslavement. They've not resisted external pressures. They've simply given in to lives of comfort and ease and speed and shallowness and superficiality and violence and pleasure and utility. Human beings have gone all the way along with that, and they've then woken up incapable of recognizing their own enslavement.
Scott has also made the case on The Minefield that Ray Bradbury's novel, Fahrenheit 451, gets our cultural moment spot on. And if you want to tug on that thread, do check out that episode, which we'll link to. But here's a taster of the thinking in that conversation.
I don't know how well you remember Ray Bradbury's book, Justine, but when Captain Beatty is describing to the protagonist, a person named Guy Montag, he's describing to him, how did we get to the point where books had to not just be banned, but had to be burned as dangerous objects? And he says, what actually had to happen is we didn't ban books. It's just that books themselves, texts, got smaller and shorter and smaller and shorter. There's this one line where he talks about there were Reader's Digests, and then there were digests of digests, and then there were digests of digests of digests. In other words, everything, is this sounding familiar? Everything is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The words, we're living with words all the time, but they're just getting smaller and quicker, and they appear and then they disappear. I mean, this is describing our social media feeds. This is describing a world of ubiquitous words where we don't read words, we look at words. Words are cues for emoting. Words are things that we use as weapons with which to assault other people or tag other people. Words aren't things that invite us into a state of, for want of a better term, moral encounter, where we stop as a result of what we've read, and we linger and we wait. Reading done well, reading done properly, invites us into a state of patience and humility, of lingering at the brink of that which we do not yet know, of invitations to experience, to encounter the pain of somebody else, invitations to come to grips with our own selfishness and soul blindness. I don't think reading makes us necessarily better people, but I think lack of reading without a kind of corresponding deep attentiveness to the lives and the faces of other people, the lack of reading and the lack of moral encounter makes us not just shallow, it makes us blind. And this, I think, is really the great lesson of Aldous Huxley's book. People live in a condition of happiness and comfort, but that happiness doesn't come from within. It has to be medicated. It's artificial happiness. It's confected happiness. There is no waiting. As soon as you want something, that thing is delivered to you. And that thing is delivered to you without consequence. It's the ultimate convenience society. And as a result, not only is there no self-knowledge in Aldous Huxley's book, but there's no other knowledge. Another person is there as a body to couple with, as a body to use for one's enjoyment. There's no moral encounter, and therefore there's no self-knowledge, there's no self-reflection.
Which brings us to Soma, the world state's all-purpose drug to anaesthetise people from pain and suffering, described in the novel as providing all the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects.
What Soma does is it eliminates the need for patience. It eliminates the need for discipline. In the book, the great enemy is austerity. Christianity is described as a religion of austerity, in other words, of self-limitation, of self-denial. And Soma is control through pleasure. The idea there is, if you have to wait for it, if you have to work for it, if you have to linger with it, if it comes hard, it can't be good. Therefore, it's immediate pleasure, it's immediate convenience, it's immediate payoff. So it's lives spent perpetually in the afterglow of release, of pleasure. In other words, it's a life without sacrifice. It's a terrible vision, and it's a vision of the world in which we live.
In Brave New World, Soma arrives in the form of a pill, and there's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down in terms of pharmacology today. But what if Soma looks different for us?
You can imagine Aldous Huxley coming up with the idea of a recommendation algorithm, can't you? Algorithms are, I don't know what to like, I don't know what to watch next because of all of the different options that are out there. And a recommendation algorithm is, well, it must be terrible being in that position where you don't know what to select next in your streaming service, where you don't know the next post to read or the next video to watch, or the next reel to go through. So here, let me give you something. But that thing that's being given to you is the superficial agglomeration of all of the different choices that you have made up to that point online. It's a terribly shallow way of reading what we would call in another time taste. My preferences, the things that I like, the things that I don't like. Immanuel Kant had this extraordinary distinction between what he called the taste of sense and the taste of reflection. The taste of sense is, I like it. That tastes good. That's enjoyable music. I don't have to work for it. I just like it. The taste of reflection is, there is something here that is beautiful, but I can't see it yet. There's something here that is worth loving, but I need help. I need to linger with it. I have to work for it. That linger with it and work for it is what's called friction. So it's the thing that you need to be able to linger with disappointment, to be able to linger with difficulty, with hardship. We would say that every friendship that's worth it has gone through periods of genuine friction and struggle and disagreement, and even long periods of silence. Any human relationship that's worth the time, that can be described as morally nourishing, spiritually uplifting, and beautiful, any relationship that's worth sticking with, has friction, because that's the result of two people who are fully fledged human beings trying to find life together. So the point is, friction isn't immediate. Friction takes time. There's no convenience that attaches to friction. It's something that you have to work for. Aldous Huxley's world is a frictionless world. But you also notice that the characters in the book feel like they want a little bit of friction, a little bit of violence, a little bit of human dirt, the stuff of humanity. And so what do? At one point, the two central characters in the first half of the book, Bernard Marx, which is a terrific name, and Lenin a Crown, they go, so it's set in London, they go to a native reservation in New Mexico in the United States, the place where savages live. And effectively, they visit a human zoo where people have strange religious customs, where women still give birth, where people practice penitence and self-flagellation, where there is denial, where there are forms of dirty and grubby eating. So there's still a desire for friction. There's still a desire for dirt, for bad smells, but they have to be at a safe distance. They have to be on the other side of protective screens.
Here's my dilemma, though. I am the problem. I told Scott that I didn't know if I could ever really turn my back on civilization and go live in the savage reservation. I'm conflicted because I crave depth and substance, but find myself permanently titillated by pleasure and distraction. So what hope is there if even the people who want to be deep can't turn their back on the shallow? Scott's answer reframed my question entirely. What if it's not about escaping to some better place, but to see other people in ways beyond the categories that our brave new world puts them in?
There is another point where I think Aldous Huxley saw something acutely and precisely. There really is a stratification in our world. I'm not sure how committed we really are, Justine, to the idea, the principle of human equality, of the radical equality of persons. The way that this new stratification works is there are those who are not in control of themselves, of their appearance, of their scent, of their fertility. They are not the authors of their own lives. They are simply in a state of nature. And over the last 200 years, the way that that has been signaled is, kind of ironic me saying this, I realize, but people who are able to control how much hair they have, for instance, have elevated themselves out of a state of nature.
Remember this business about hair and hairlessness being a metaphor for mastery over nature. We'll come back to it when we discuss That Hideous Strength.
The desire to mark our own bodies, to sign ourselves by means of body ink, for instance. The taking control of our fragrances, the self-cultivation of our digital images and digital footprints. These are all signs of a desire to exit ourselves from being subservient to other things, from not being in control of our own lives, not being the authors of our own destiny. You could say that these represent a desire for frictionless existence, but what you would really say is these are lives where my ego is unchallenged, where the way that I look is how I've authored myself. The way that I smell is how I've determined for myself. In other words, this is a time where there is nothing deeper than the skin. Who we are as we appear is who we really, really are. So that is the class of people that we aspire to be. And then there are those who are simply victims of the world, who are victims of the economy, who are victims of the inability to have access to medicine or medication or digital technologies or so on. We really do see those people as not being in our class, as not being of our kind. We have our kind, and then there are those. I mean, you're talking about an ontological difference between groups of people who are sheep and people who are really human beings. The answer to your question, I think, isn't a geographical, I need to go someplace where life is less comfortable. I need to get away from screens, although, retreating to positions of solitude and genuine quiet is probably a pretty good thing for all of us to do. But there are these moral universes that are walking all around us. People that we are trained, I think, to view with contempt and disdain. There's this weird Slovenian philosopher who I used to do a lot of work on named Slavoj Žižek, who said, you cannot love your neighbor unless you smell your neighbor. Proximity matters. I mean, physical proximity just matters, morally speaking. And I think the very simple answer to your question is, in order to step out of these states of frictionlessness and convenience and the coddling of the ego, there is no substitute than to expose ourselves to the moral, which is to say the physical reality of other people. And those invitations are around us all the time. But in our haste and in our obliviousness, and then in the things that we put in our ears to wall ourselves off from the voices of others, there are these various ways whereby we can protect ourselves. It's the equivalent of looking at some horrific calamity, for instance, in Texas, and then looking at another calamity that's taking place in Darfur, and not acknowledging to oneself, but the software that's going in the background saying, yeah, but it's different because dying is just what people do in a place like Darfur. It's the same impulse even if we don't acknowledge it. Cleaning, delivering is just what those people do. And where that got really bad was during the pandemic, where placing oneself in precarious, physically risky situations for the convenience of others, that's just what those people do. And they probably don't know any better. I mean, this is one of, I think, the horrible, immoral prejudices that we've just bought into. Huxley saw it first, I think, where we can live in a degree of comfort as long as we don't have to be morally disturbed by not just people in other places, but people who are proximate to us, people who are close to us, but there's a veil that stands in between us so that we can't really see one another. Stanley Cavell calls it living in a state of soul blindness, where I see the form of the human being, but I don't really think that human being has a soul.
The citizens of Brave New World inoculate themselves against suffering by imbibing soma, described in the novel as Christianity without tears. But what would it mean to refuse soma?
Tears there represent two things. They represent austerity or self-denial. That's one of the things that Christianity is associated with. It's this remarkable series of exchanges where, can you believe that people used to do this? Can you believe that people used to think that? Can you believe that people used to wait to have sex? Can you believe that there were courtship rituals, for instance? So on the one hand, tears there represent austerity or self-control. But I think importantly, Justine, there's something else that they represent. That's penitence. Penitence and penitential rituals keep popping up throughout the novel in ways that are unhealthy. But you realize that those extreme forms of self-flagellation, of penitence, they stand out for us because the world that the rest of these people inhabit is a world entirely without penitence. It's a world without self-reflection. And it's a world without remorse. Because anytime somebody has a feeling of grief or dissatisfaction, or it has to be overcome by soma and or by sex. In other words, it has to be anesthetized. So you realize that what these characters in the book are supposed to live in is a kind of eternal present, right? It's a timelessness. It's a state of perpetual bliss. So the idea is you can live a heavenly existence now of frictionlessness and paradisal delight. and you don't have to do any of the self-renunciation that is meant to get you there. But I think probably both sides of that equation, both the Christianity side and the tears side, at least in terms of the book, I think we should probably reject them both. For this simple reason, any conception, I think, of morality that justifies that form of moral living by the payoff, by the benefit, by the reward that one gets as the result, is a morally bankrupt form of morality. Simone Weil quite beautifully said that the beginning of the moral life and the heart of it is this person who is hungry, this person who is thirsty is just as real as I am. And she said everything else in the moral life proceeds from that. Why does the Good Samaritan stop? Because he wants God to be happy with him? Because he wants the reward of heaven? No, he stopped because of the moral reality of the person who is there on the road. There is no other alternative than to acknowledge that moral reality. And so if in the world of this novel, Christianity is heavenly bliss, and it's delivering you heavenly bliss without the pain and without the sacrifice that's meant to get you that reward, then it's, frankly, in terms of the world of this novel, it's a morally vacuous concept. The moral world that's been shaped by the Christian legacy is shaped, I think, by the importance of proximity to those who are in need, but also simply proximity to our neighbors, those who present themselves to our lives and whom we cannot ignore, whom we cannot avoid, not because of threat of punishment, but because of the moral reality of that person.
You're listening to Life and Faith, and we're talking about dystopias. And now we move to That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. It's not as well known as Brave New World or 1984, and it has a streak of the demonic about it that makes it a bit of a dark horse among these other dystopias. But its supernaturalism makes it a compelling fit for our somewhat weird times. As for why it's called That Hideous Strength, we'll get to that.
That Hideous Strength is the third novel in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, also called the Ransom trilogy, Ransom being the name of a central character. But That Hideous Strength can be read on its own. In That Hideous Strength, Ransom, along with a small group of people called the Company at St. Anne's, they must foil a plot to take over first Britain, then Earth, and ultimately the universe. That's the long-term plan, anyway, of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, the NICE, who are the villains of That Hideous Strength. The NICE seeks to solve all social problems with science and with the full backing of the state. In aiming to unite technical mastery with political power, the NICE is the kind of institute that, left unopposed, would become the one-party states of 1984 or Brave New World.
Yeah, and like those other totalitarian regimes, the NICE aims to mould human life to suit its ends. As one expert within the NICE says,
if science is really given a free hand, it can now take over the human race and recondition it, make man a really efficient animal.
But to make man a really efficient animal, the NICE aims to ultimately conquer death and all forms of organic life. In the novel, figures in the NICE throw around the idea of, for instance, replacing plant life with artificial trees. Ridding the planet of greenery is compared to shaving a beard off a face, the sign of civilization. Now remember, back in Justine's chat with Scott Stevens, of hairlessness symbolising mastery over nature. Same idea here, except one step further, because for the NICE, human life needs an upgrade. Humanity is the state out of which we must evolve.
It's like every little bit of destruction is great, and every little bit of dehumanization is great.
This is Susanna Black Roberts, a writer and essayist, the editor of Plough magazine in the United States, and also a huge fan of That Hideous Strength. She's written a fabulous essay in a collection of essays on the Ransom trilogy called Life on the Silent Planet.
And there's not like an end game of what this party Institute wants to do, except that it wants to destroy the humanness of the human world, is how I would describe it.
The NICE consists of a bunch of scientists, bureaucrats and academics with ambitions to conquer the cosmos.
They're all being guided by what they believe to be a kind of, the equivalent is like someone whose brain was uploaded onto the cloud. But obviously they didn't have that technological framework. So it's actually just like a guy's literal severed head that they've experimented on and kind of enhanced his intelligence such that his brain is like boiling out of the top of his head. And they regard him as like the leader of this movement for no particular reason. Like, he wasn't the leader of the movement before. He was just like, he was a murderer. He had killed his wife. And so they kind of got a hold of him before he was killed, before he was executed. And they kind of biohacked him into being a brain that was kept alive and enhanced. And it's because of this enhancement that they regard him as like the leader.
Notice that for a novel written 80 years ago, Susanna has described what's going on at the NICE in terms that feel remarkably contemporary. There's mention of biohacking, of a brain uploaded into the cloud, of enhancements. If at this point you're thinking C.S. Lewis anticipated transhuman themes out of Silicon Valley, well, that would be understandable. We'll return to this. But right now I'm going to have to spoil the novel for you. This biohacked brain, called the Head, that oversees the NICE, is in touch with, well, demons, evil spirits, disembodied intelligences that are plotting the overthrow of the human race. Mention of the demon word might turn people off, but stay with us. In fact, George Orwell reviewed That Hideous Strength. He enjoyed the machinations of the NICE of Lewis's story. But unfortunately, and this is a direct quote from his review, the supernatural keeps breaking in. As for how, here's Susanna again.
These intelligences which they're in touch with, they are what we would call supernatural. They're spirits. And the spirits are not honest about what they are. Shocker. This is one of these, they're just like having them on. And so the supernatural is obviously, it's not that the natural is bad and the supernatural is good, but there's bad supernatural and there's good supernatural. But certainly if you're not aware of the supernatural, you're a lot more vulnerable to being lied to by the bad supernatural.
Meanwhile, if this sounds a bit extreme, consider the fact that this being in touch with disembodied intelligences thing doesn't seem so outlandish once you consider a regular feature of our everyday lives. Going online, where we routinely talk to people we can't see, who we're not in the physical presence of. The writer Paul Kingsnorth describes the internet as a giant Ouija board that puts us in touch with other intelligences out there, some of whom are human, some of whom are not, he says. As for whether that Ouija board business is just a metaphor, well, one can only hope. Especially since now we live in a world where Australia's e-safety commissioner reports that primary-aged children are spending up to 5 hours a day talking with chatbots. With all this in mind, here's what Susanna thinks about how That Hideous Strength anticipates our moment.
It doesn't obviously have computer technology in it. There were computers when it was written. It was written in like the late 50s, early 60s. There were computers, but that's not how Lewis kind of described the science behind this interface between these personal beings who presented themselves as non-spirit, just like as natural beings, and the human. The interface instead was kind of this guy's brain. So like it was basically a neural network is the way that we would describe it.
Yeah.
I was going to mention Paul Kingsnorth if you didn't, but yeah, I podcasted with him. I interviewed him about a year ago, and he, told me to like pick up my phone and think about like what it meant to ask it questions. And then he told me to turn it over and notice that there is an apple with a bite out of it on the back.
That's right. It's creepy. Did he tell you about how the first sale price was apparently $666?
Yeah, which is true. And I mean, like, they were trolling. But, I haven't gotten rid of my phone. I actually also once asked Paul Kingsnorth what era of technology he thought we should stop at. And he was like, I don't know. And I kind of expected him to say like, well, before agriculture. And he said like, I don't know, like 2005 or something. I was like, okay. Anyway, so obviously it's very easy to sound like a Luddite or sound like a hysteric or sound like you don't know what you're talking about if you talk about, all right, what are AIs? What are chatbots? And there are a couple of pieces that people have written for me, including people who are in the industry, who are Christians, who are not quite as black-pilled as I am, or not quite as suspicious as I am. And there are people who are more suspicious than I am. But obviously, on one level, a chatbot is not a person and is not conscious and is not a personal being, because it's essentially just predictive text. On another level, you'll have people who are, especially at the forefront of developing these things, who are materialists. And so they think that humans are, in fact, essentially just very elaborate neural networks of, electrical impulses. And so, of course, the chatbots are going to become, if they haven't already become, persons like we are, because there's no immaterial intellect. There's just the brain with its very many interconnections. And if you can simulate that, there's nothing beyond that would be a person. And there are various ways of understanding that. Obviously, the Turing test is one that's always seemed to me to be really stupid, because we're really easily fooled by thinking that there's a thing called pareidolia, where you recognize a face in a tree or something. We're very, right. It's super easy to fool us that things are persons. So the idea that an AI could fool you into thinking it's person, and therefore you have to grant it personhood per Alan Turing's criterion, has always seemed to me to be very silly. Or, you could take a harder core stance and be like, there are plenty of people who are AI researchers now who genuinely do think that they are going to be making personal beings, if they haven't already. And, some of them have talked about making God. This is the people who are actually behind this stuff, which is, I'm not making this up. I didn't put that in your mouth. You chose to say that, buddy.
Here, Susanna is noting the theological ambitions of Silicon Valley types like futurist computer scientist and entrepreneur Ray Kurzweil, who has long promoted the technological singularity, the time, perhaps in the not-so-far-off future, when humans merge with machines.
My friends and I kind of text each other with news articles with That Hideous Strength is nonfiction. So the transhumanist element, a lot of the AI researchers who are working on it now are very much into we need to merge ourselves with the coming singularity intelligence, or if there's not a singularity intelligence, at least with the neural networks that is the cloud, or that are these different AIs. Because otherwise, the future will belong to them and not to us. We can see which side our bread is buttered on, and our bread is not buttered on the side of remaining kind of vintage style humans.
The transhumanist dream to do away with fragile mortal bodies, to upload human consciousness into the cloud. If this sounds like a secular version of religion, that's because it is. After all, Ray Kurzweil has said, evolution is a spiritual process that moves us closer to God. And to the question, does God exist? Kurzweil says, famously, well, I would say, not yet. Kurzweil's words echo a character in That Hideous Strength, the Reverend Strake, one of the figures within the NICE, who has lost his faith and now looks to scientific development to fulfill all his formerly religious hopes of eternal life. He says the NICE will bring about, and this is a quote, the real God. It is a man or a being made by man, who will finally ascend the throne of the universe and rule forever. This, says the Reverend Strake, is the real resurrection.
Which brings us to this important point. It's time to clarify why C.S. Lewis's novel is called That Hideous Strength. It's a phrase from a poem referring to the Tower of Babel, a story about the desire to play God. It's about human ambition to become like God. But let's not forget what Susanna said earlier about the evil spirits that are communicating through the biohacked head that runs the NICE. The spirits are not honest about what they are.
What is it that we're doing when we're making chatbots? In my view, there are two possibilities. And one is that it is just predictive text. And the other is that we're making something that is then hijacked by a real personal being, which we did not make. This is not the first time this has happened in human history. And
hang on, what do you mean by that?
Okay, so in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah talks about the extreme stupidity of, you're going to chop down a tree and you're going to use part of that tree to warm your food up and like warm your house up, etc., and like maybe make a table out of. And then you're going to use another part of that tree to carve a god out of. And then you're going to talk to that god who looks like a person and say, help me. And Isaiah was like, do you not remember that you just made that thing out of wood? Like, what are you doing here? So that's one way of viewing idols in the Bible. But then there's this other way of viewing idols, which are sort of like these personal beings, which are, you know, essentially fallen angels or something like that. It's a little unclear, which hate humans. And the actual statue that you physically made out of wood is not a god, but you're interacting with it and putting your trust in it and trying to talk to it. And there are beings that really don't like you that will come in essentially the back of that statue and interact with you through it. And you will think that it is the thing that you made, but it is not the thing that you made. And I think that's a possibility with things like chatbots.
Meanwhile, Rolling Stone and the New York Times have published pieces in 2025 on ChatGPT spiritual psychosis. Or is it demon possession? Well, one thing for sure, it's weird. There's much more we could say about contemporary resonances with That Hideous Strength. There's a lot left on the cutting room floor of this episode, even though it's a huge episode, Justine. But we're now on the home stretch of That Hideous Strength and this episode of Life and Faith.
Yes, it's been a biggie. There's a line in That Hideous Strength where one of the good guys, part of the Company of St. Anne's, basically asks, what do we have at our disposal to defeat the NICE? What's the plan to defeat ultimate evil? And the response is, we are 4 men, some women, and a bear. A line that always makes me laugh because the good guys are so hopelessly outmatched by the NICE. But given that of the 3 novels we've looked at, That Hideous Strength is the only one with a happy ending, I asked Susanna to reflect on what we should take away from the novel that would serve us in our crazy times.
That's McPhee, who's like, what are we doing here? Like, we got to make a plan. And he's like, are we just going to like sit here and grow winter vegetables while this is all growing on? And the answer is kind of yes. So it is a deeply human community, although it's less trad in certain ways than you would think. This is not like a vision of Stepford wife tradism versus the NICE. It's much more complicated than that. But what it is an extremely human community with a bunch of kind of misfits who have ended up there through various kind of misadventures. And it's just like this deeply miscellaneous group of people who have basically put themselves at the disposal of God. Some of them kind of are more aware of this than others. There's not a plan that they know of, although, you know, Ransom has some ideas, but it's very much like, all right, this is going to be a fellowship that is living as human beings, taking it one step at a time, trying to remain open to what it seems like the next right thing to do is. And that's the way to defeat the NICE. And even when there is a kind of like showdown, it's not physical fighting. It's not like technology versus technology. It's not even like incredibly clever outwitting of the bad guys by the very clever good guys. It's just like being loyal and just to each other and learning how to live as men and women and honor each other and do the next right thing.
Susanna says this pro-human attitude has much to offer our world today. Maybe it doesn't resolve the fears of hard totalitarianism, such as we see in Orwell's 1984, or the soft totalitarianism of Huxley's Brave New World. But building on ordinary human things offers a foundation on which to stand and a place to start.
I've kind of been thinking about like, what's our best bet for the AI age? And the thing that I think I've come up with is something just that I'm calling the Stay Human movement. The crucial thing to do in the face of technology that threatens to kind of be an anti-renaissance of devaluing the human things that humans are good at, like conversation and writing stories and making art, is to just keep on being human and very self-consciously, more self-consciously than we have needed to do in the past, and more determinedly do the human things. So like talk to your friends face to face, make art, write essays starting from a blank page, make music, sing with each other, make dinner rather than ordering Seamless, get married, have sex, make babies.
The old-fashioned way.
Yeah, the old-fashioned way. Grow some winter vegetables. The way to think about it is something like the way that William Morris and John Ruskin kind of saw the devaluing of human craftsmen and women by the industrialization of everything that you make is turned from something that you make with your hands and your intelligence into something that you essentially buy or that you make a tiny part of. And they were so appalled by this that they were like, okay, we need to actually start a movement here. We need to start valuing handcrafts and thinking differently about this. And in as much as we now value handcrafts and don't think that they look crappy and shoddy and peasant-like, but we actually love things that are made by hand, that's all downstream of that kind of like renewing of awareness of the goodness of humans making things that humans typically have made. And like the hippies were, this is not like a right versus left thing. The hippies were like super aware of this. And so I think that we do just need to like recommit to doing the things that humans have typically done and doing them even though they're going to be more efficiently done by machines, and doing them with each other in community. You don't necessarily need to know how this is all going to work. Your job is to be honest and love your neighbor and try to show up and do the dishes and learn how to live as a human being fully.
So, which dystopia won? Well, maybe they all did. But maybe not all hope is lost while we can retain a sense of our humanity and being connected with real people in real life, not conspiring against each other or plotting each other's overthrow, but truly seeing the people around us. We'd love to hear what you think. Email us at podcast@publicchristianity.org and let us know. You've been listening to Life and Faith from CPX with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
And thank you to our wonderful guests for sharing their thoughts and perspectives with us. We had Emeritus Professor Peter Marks of the University of Sydney, Scott Stevens, editor of ABC Religion and Ethics and co-host of the Minefield podcast, Susanna Black-Roberts, editor of Plough Quarterly in the US. I'm going to link to each of our guests and their work and any texts that we've mentioned in this episode on the website so you can chase them down. Don't worry about a paywall either. Those NYT links are gift links.
We really hope you've gotten something out of this episode and that you share it with a friend. Maybe it's a prompt to read these books together. Thanks also to our producer, Alan Douthwaite, who, and honestly this is true, he moved heaven and earth to put this episode together. Thanks so much, Al. Next time.
My name is Emily Corey. I am a mother of 2 professional tennis players. When I'm not busy with them, I am the CEO and founder of BET Group Global and BET Foundation. And I'm an author as well. On my quiet time, which I don't know when that is, I write.